three of the most well-known straight-decked aircraft carriers, the trio of the mighty Yorktown class. USS Ranger CV-4 was the first purpose-built carrier for the American Navy, but the Yorktowns were the first purpose-built multi-ship members of a class, as the Lexingtons were both originally built as battlecruisers before conversion during construction. The mighty USS Yorktown CV-5, USS Enterprise CV-6, and USS Hornet CV-8. The standalone USS Wasp was CV-7, which is why there's a gap in the three sisters' hull numbers, and she was a much smaller carrier. So, what happened to the mighty trio? Well, today's episode of Fate of, which once again is not a history video, only their fates will be in here, and their commissioning dates. But no context in between, as that's for a history video. So, let's go over the fate of all three. Usually, I go from the first ship to the last, in order of hull number, but today I won't. Enterprise will be last, as she's, well, Enterprise, and she goes where she wants. People often confuse USS Yorktown CV-5 with the preserved CV-10, an Essex-class carrier named after her, and some people think CV-10 is CV-5 and sunk in 1942, and vice versa. You'd be surprised how many comments on shorts I get about that. Same goes for Hornet and Lexington. Now, the mighty Yorktown was named after the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. She was laid down at the famous and still active today Newport News Shipbuilding in Newport News, Virginia, on May 21st, 1934, launched on April 4th, 1936, and commissioned on September 30th, 1937, and she would go on to gain the following honors, the fewest between the three ships: American Defense Service Medal, American Campaign Medal, Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal with 3 battle stars, and the World War II Victory Medal. However, she would not survive the war. During the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 7, 1942, Lexington CV-2 was so heavily damaged she had to be scuttled, and Yorktown, while heavily damaged, managed to return to Pearl Harbor, and the damages were estimated at a 2-week repair time. Yorktown was back at sea 72 hours later. She would go on to take part in the Battle of Midway with her two sisters, Hornet and Enterprise, between June 4th and June 7th of 1942. She absorbed most of the Japanese aerial attacks, helping out her two sisters. On June 4th, she was crippled after 2 Japanese attacks from the carrier Hiryu would disable her. In fact, she herself would later sink after being scuttled the next day on June 5th. It was a bad day for carriers. Yorktown would take a 23-degree list to port after the attacks and would lose all power. She was taken under tow by the USS Vero, who survived the war. Editor here, I apologize, it's Vireo. On June 6th, Japanese submarine I-168, who would later sink in July 1943, fired torpedoes at the Yorktown, 2 of which hit the Yorktown, and 1 hit the destroyer USS Hammond, who had been providing power for the Yorktown. The destroyer would almost immediately sink as the torpedo broke her back. Yorktown, however, would survive, but she would sink early in the next morning on June 7th, 1942. Nearby ships went to half-mast, and 2 overhead flying PBY Catalinas dipped their wings in salute of the fallen carrier as she went down. 141 of her crew died, but most of her crew survived. In 1998, her wreck was found on May 19th by none other than the mighty Robert Ballard, aka the finder of a lot of ships, especially Titanic and the Bismarck. He's almost as famous for it as the RV Petrel, who, up until recently, a few years ago, was still finding wrecks. However, what happened to her 2 sisters? USS Hornet CV-8 suffers the same fate as her older sister, as she's often confused with the preserved Hornet CV-12, another Essex class. CV-2, USS Lexington, is also confused with Lexington CV-16, who, despite the hull number, is actually the oldest surviving Essex. Because logic. She was built by Newport News Shipbuilding, just like her two sisters. She was laid down on September 25th, 1939, launched on December 14th, 1940, and commissioned on October 20th, 1941. And she would get the following honors, one more than her sister: American Defense Service Medal, American Campaign Medal, Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal with 4 battle stars, one more than Yorktown, and the World War II Victory Medal. However, just like Yorktown, she would not only not survive the war, she also wouldn't survive 1942. On October 26, 1942, Hornet and Enterprise fought in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, where Hornet was attacked by torpedo bombers and traditional bombers, and power was knocked out to her engines. The Japanese aircraft then went after the Enterprise, allowing the heavy cruiser USS Northampton, which sank on December 1st, 1942, to take Hornet under tow. Just as power was about to be restored, 9 torpedo bombers this time attacked Hornet. While 8 missed, number 9 didn't and found its mark, doing even more damage to the heavily damaged but already repaired electrical system. With word on an advancing Japanese fleet, she was ordered to be sunk, as she could not be pulled free in time before the Japanese would catch up to her. 9 American torpedoes failed to sink her. Classically, many just failed to explode, as so many during World War II did. Destroyers Mustin and Anderson shot more than 400 5-inch rounds at the Hornet, but left when Japanese forces entered the area. The Japanese then used 4 torpedoes to finally sink the Hornet, which was the last American carrier ever sunk. That was a fleet carrier. Escort carriers, however, would continue having fairly heavy losses throughout World War II. She was sunk early in the morning on October 27, 1942, with the loss of 140 of her 2,200 sailors. Only one less loss than her sister, but both fairly low casualty rates, so that's at least a plus. So, what about her final sister, the middle and most loved? The Big E, Lucky E, the Galloping Ghost, and the Grey Ghost, aka the mighty, most decorated American warship in history, the USS Enterprise CV-6, built by Newport News Shipbuilding like her 2 fallen sisters. She was laid down on July 16, 1934, launched on October 3, 1936, and commissioned on October 3, 1938, exactly 2 years later. During World War II, she would be the first American ship to sink a full-sized enemy warship in the Pacific War, sinking submarine I-70 on December 10, 1941, 3 days after Pearl Harbor. 3 times during the war, the Japanese said she was sunk, but she never was, getting the nickname the Grey Ghost. By war's end, she became an absolute menace. She and her planes shot down 911 enemy planes, sunk 71 ships, and damaged and destroyed another 192 more. She was an absolute menace to those who opposed her, or sunk her sisters. Her many honors are as follows: Presidential Unit Citation, Navy Unit Commendation, American Defense Service Medal, American Campaign Medal, Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal with, just a few more than her sister, 20 battle stars, the most in American history, the World War II Victory Medal, the Philippine Presidential Unit Citation, the Philippine Liberation Medal, and she even got a British Admiralty pendant as a token of respect. The mighty Enterprise was finally decommissioned on February 17, 1947, and stricken on October 2, 1956. Despite attempts to preserve her, they all failed, as nobody raised enough money to buy her from the Navy after plans to transfer her to the state of New York fell through in 1949. The Navy sold her for scrap on July 1, 1958, with scrapping completed in May of 1960, committing, in many people's eyes, a crime against history and a crime against the American people. However, at least we do have bits and pieces to remember her by. Her bell is at the U.S. Naval Academy and is often heard ringing. Her commissioning plaque and one of her anchors are on display at the Washington Navy Yard, and her stern nameplate was on display near Little League in Rivervale, New Jersey, until 2025, when it was refurbished and put on display next to the mighty Iowa-class fast battleship, the USS New Jersey, and will be until the National Museum of the U.S. Navy is completed. 4 portholes on USS Enterprise CVN-65, her much later successor, will now be transferred to USS Enterprise CVN-80, all 4 of which were originally from the Enterprise herself, when its construction at least gets far enough. So, in a recap, Yorktown and Hornet were both lost in 1942, but Enterprise went to make the Japanese pay for sinking her 2 sisters, and being just an absolute menace. We have nothing from Yorktown and Hornet, but we do have some artifacts from the menace herself, the USS Enterprise. And while, in a lot of people's opinions, including mine, it's a crime she wasn't preserved, at least some items are better than none, and much better than her 2 sisters. And in a way, what's left of her really does honor both her 2 sisters, and all of those who fought and died during World War II. Sure, no ship may be preserved of the class, but they are often remembered, as all 3 are not only famous, but they were the first class of American aircraft carriers built as a class, and numbers 2, 3, and 4 of purpose-built American aircraft carriers. All 3, especially the USS Enterprise, the menace herself, deserve to be remembered. French battleships were known for their all-forward gun design towards the end of the era of the French battleships being built, prior to World War II, for example, the Jean Bart or the Dunkirk. However, the British favored more traditional gun arrangements, but for 2 ships, they went all in with 3 triple turrets all in front. The Nelson-class battleships of the Royal Navy, Nelson and her sister, the Rodney. So, in today's Fate of, which, as usual, is not a history video, we'll go over the fates of the 2 Nelson-class battleships. HMS Nelson was the lead ship of the class. She was laid down on December 28, 1922, launched on September 3, 1925, formally commissioned on August 15, 1927, but only entered service after additional trials on October 27th of 1927. She would go on to serve in World War II and earn the following honors: Malta convoys 1941-42, North Africa 1942-43, Sicily 1943, Salerno 1943, Mediterranean 1943, and Normandy 1944. Many times she would be damaged by various mines and torpedoes, but none ever did enough to actually sink her. So she would go on to survive the war, and it's far too many to mention here. Early in 1946, HMS Nelson was converted to a training ship, as she was starting to get worn out after not receiving the best maintenance during the war, and most ships during the war didn't get the best maintenance because that was not a priority, for obvious reasons. So she was converted to a training ship, and then later, on October 20th, 1947, sent to the reserve fleets. She was formally decommissioned in February of 1948 and stricken on May 19th, 1948. From June 4th to September 23rd, 1948, she was used as a target ship for armor-piercing aerial bombs to test their ability to puncture her decks. Obviously, she survived. She was turned over on January 5th, 1949, to the British Iron and Steel Corporation, and then allocated to the THOS W ward for scrap. The BISC basically handled all the Royal Navy ships that were being decommissioned, and then they would allocate them to various scrapyards across the country. She arrived at Inverkeithing, Scotland on May 15, 1949, where she would be scrapped. Her bell was returned to Newcastle in 1949 and put on display at the Leaning Art Gallery. So, what happened to her younger sister? Rodney was the second and final member of the class. She was built by the Camel Laird in Birkenhead. She was laid down on December 28, 1922, the same day as Nelson. She'd be launched on December 17, 1925, completed in August 1927, but commissioned on December 7, 1927 for the same reasons as the Nelson. She would also go on to serve in World War II, and was one of several British ships that took down the Bismarck in 1941. During World War II, she would gather the following honors: Norway, 1940, Atlantic, 1940-41, Bismarck, 1941, Malta convoys, 41-42, North Africa, 42-43, Sicily, 43, Salerno, 43, Mediterranean, 43, English Channel, 1944, Normandy, 44, and Arctic, 44. She was taken out of service in August of 1946, as she was in very poor condition, as she had almost no work done to her during the war, let alone any refits. Like Nelson in 1949, in 1948, she was transferred to the British Iron and Steel Corporation and also allocated to the THOS W ward on March 26, 1948, and taken to Scotland to be scrapped. She was scrapped alongside those who would later join her: HMS Revenge, another battleship, and her own older sister, HMS Nelson. Those two were sold for scrap in 48 and 49 respectively. HMS Rodney's bell is currently on display at the Royal Navy Portsmouth Museum. I'm going to leave that in there because sometimes I just need to leave a bit of a lesson in a video for myself. So, in a recap, both the Nelson and the Rodney were scrapped together, for the most part. Rodney was fully scrapped before Nelson was completely scrapped, but it's close enough. And now, each of their bells is also preserved, but nothing else as far as I could find. They were unique for the Royal Navy in design, but they did do their jobs fairly well considering everything and being a full forward design. They may have been the oddballs of the Royal Navy's battleship fleet, but both HMS Nelson and her sister, HMS Rodney, deserve to be remembered. Destroyers, my favorite being HMCS Haida. However, there is a Polish class that is one of my favorite destroyer classes. So in today's episode of Fate of, let's go over the first Polish ships to feature in Fate of, the two Grom-class destroyers, also known as the Thunderbolt class of the Polish Navy. Grom and her sister, Błyskawica. Two more ships of the class were ordered, but the first was laid down just after war broke out, and therefore they were never completed, leaving just the Grom and the Błyskawica as the two members of the class. The Groms are some of the most heavily armed and some of the fastest destroyers in World War II, both having been built by the J. Samuel White shipyard in the Isle of Wight. Now again, Fate of is not a history series as per usual, and I am using my Hypercast Quadcast mic today, so hopefully the audio is a little bit better. Now, onto the Grom. The first member of the class, Thunderbolt, the ORP Grom, was laid down on July 17, 1935, launched on July 20th, 1936, and commissioned on May 11th, 1937. She was only 2 years old when World War II started, but she would never make it through her third year. She, along with her sister Błyskawica and a slightly older destroyer, the Burza, joined the British on September 1st, 1939, to avoid certain destruction by Germany. Now, on May 4th, 1940, Grom was doing naval gunfire support missions in the Narvik area of the Rombeeken Fjord when she was attacked by a Heinkel HE-111 bomber and hit with 2 bombs. This would spell the end for the Grom as she sank after an internal explosion, taking 59 of her crew down with her, but 154 survived. On October 6, 1986, Grom's wreck was dived on and explored for the first time. Now, there is a memorial for the soldiers and sailors who died during the Battle of Narvik, created on September 1st, 1979, on the 40th anniversary of the outbreak of World War II. The memorial is located in Grom's Place in Narvik, the park itself named after Thunderbolt, the ORP Grom. However, 1940 would not be the end of her class. The second and final completed member, Lightning Bolt, the ORP Biskovica, laid down on October 1st, 1935, and launched a year later on October 1st, 1936, and commissioned on November 25th, 1937. She would not only go on to fight in World War II, but she, unlike so many other Polish ships like her sister and the submarine ORP Orzel, she would survive the war. And she would go on to be decommissioned on May 1st, 1976. Not a bad run for a World War II era destroyer. She had not sailed, however, since mid-1967 after a high-pressure steam pipe exploded, killing 7 sailors. She would never be repaired, and was made into an anti-aircraft ship for
Świnoujście
in 1969, until her decommissioning in 1976. Sorry for using Google's voice for the name. I tried and pronounced it many times, and it was a complete disaster. So I thought Google is better than nothing. Now, Biskovica became a museum in May 1976 at Gdynia, replacing the slightly older and earlier mentioned Berza, who would end up being scrapped in 1977. Biskovica is currently the oldest preserved destroyer in the world. And while she was preserved in 1976, a destroyer she often served with during World War II was preserved 11 years before, in August of 1965. The sole surviving member of the 27 tribal class destroyers of the Royal Navy, the Royal Australian Navy, and the Royal Canadian Navy. The Royal Canadian tribal class destroyer HMCS Haida, the fightingest ship in the Navy. In fact, on June 28, 2006, since both ships served in the same unit, the British-led 10th Destroyer Flotilla in World War II, and as its sole 2 survivors, HMCS Haida and the ORP Biskovica were officially twinned, in a way becoming sisters, fitting really, as both are sole survivors of their classes, and both are the sole preserved destroyers in their countries, and both carry on the legacy of their fallen sisters, the Grom for Biskovica, and 26 for Haida. 1 sunk, 1 preserved. That's not a bad class survival rate at 50%. Many times, no members are preserved, like the several classes of American 4-stacker destroyers. There's not one left above the waves. And while a Grom may have been lost, her sister, Biskovica, is preserved and is able to carry on the memory of her fallen sister to this day, just like Haida and her 26 fallen sisters. And that's better than most ships get. Both ships, especially the lost Grom, deserve to be remembered. Dreadnoughts, and then the super dreadnoughts were the progression of the American battleship fleet for most of its existence. Fast battleships were the last type of American battleships, 10 of which were built in 3 classes. The first had 2 members, and the last 2 had 4. The last 2 being the South Dakota class, with the last 2 ships, 59 and 60, preserved, and the Iowa class, 61 through 64, were all preserved. However, the first class, the North Carolinas, paved the way for the 2 classes that followed. So, in today's episode of Fate of, let's look into the fate of its 2 members, North Carolina and her sister, the Washington. As per usual, Fate of is not a history series. Now, on to USS North Carolina. USS North Carolina was the very first American fast battleship. PB-55, she was nicknamed the Showboat and built by the New York Naval Shipyard. She was laid down on October 27th, 1937, launched on June 13th, 1940, 12 days after her sister Washington, and commissioned on April 9th, 1941. She would go on to fight in World War II and survive without any major ship-threatening damage. She would briefly operate on the American East Coast from 1946 until her decommissioning on June 27, 1947, during World War II, having almost solely served in the Pacific. She was stricken on June 1, 1960, and was supposed to be sold for scrap. However, she would not meet the cutter's torch. A North Carolina man, James Craig, founded a campaign to save the ship, modeled on the same process used to save the USS Texas, the only preserved dreadnought battleship in existence. With the help of the newspapers and of a TV station, of a $250,000 goal at the time, $330,000 was raised to save both the ship, pay for towing, for a site for the battleship to reside in, and to make the ship a museum upon arrival. 3 cities were considered: Southport, Morehead City, and Wilmington, all in North Carolina. In the end, Wilmington was chosen, as it was further inland and much more protected from hurricanes. She was transferred to the state of North Carolina from the Navy on September 6, 1961, and left for her new home from Bayonne, New Jersey on September 25th, towed by 9 tugboats. They proceeded to lose control of her on the Cape Fear River, and she hit a floating restaurant with minimal damage. She was pushed into her final resting spot off the Cape Fear River, across the river from downtown Wilmington. After repairs, she opened on April 29, 1962, and has been a museum ship ever since. However, her hull has significantly deteriorated by the early 2000s. So, they put a cofferdam around the ship, just like the USS Alabama, which allows water to be pumped out and work done right where the ship sits, and not need to be towed to a dry dock, which is very expensive. In 2018, a walkway was put on the top of the cofferdam so visitors can view the ship from all sides. The North Carolina has not moved since she was put in her final resting place, and in 2022 enjoyed 250,000 visitors, and its most financially successful year in its history. However, what about her younger sister, the Washington? Washington, BB-56, was the second and final member of the class, built by the Philadelphia Navy Yard. She was laid down on June 14, 1938, launched 12 days before North Carolina on June 1, 1940, and commissioned on May 15, 1941, the month after her sister. She would fight in World War II, sinking the IJN Kirishima following the naval battle of Guadalcanal on November 15, 1942. Washington would go on to survive the war, just like her sister. She was decommissioned on June 27, 1947, and stricken on June 1, 1960, having been decommissioned and stricken the same day as her older sister. However, unfortunately, unlike the North Carolina, Washington was not as fortunate, as she was not saved, being sold for scrap on May 24, 1961, and cut up. I couldn't find any pieces of her preserved. I couldn't even find if her bell survives, which is rather unusual that, at least in my experience from the research I've done, that a capital ship doesn't have its bell preserved in a museum somewhere, even if it's just in storage. And again, that's off of ships I have researched, so it's quite possible, since I have researched the vast majority, that it could just be the ones I'm looking at. But I could not find if Washington's bell survives, which, if it isn't, that's truly a tragedy, as it would at least be some part of the ship. Preserved is much better than none, but in this case, as far as I know, we have none. She did have a rather unfortunate fate, unlike her sister, but at least the North Carolina lives on. The first American fast battleship is preserved, and the second was the only one of the 3 American fast battleships that were ever scrapped, along with South Dakota 57 and 58. One preserved and one scrapped is a phrase often heard in this series, with many ship classes being only 2 or 3 members that I've covered so far. While it would be nice to have a 100% survival rate, like for example the Iowa class with its 4 members, I would argue that one is much better than none. Especially in this case, where the preserved ship is not only the lead ship, but is the very first of her type with the American Navy as a fast battleship. So at least North Carolina still exists to carry on her fallen sister's legacy, and one is so much better than none. For example, here in Canada, most of our ships were scrapped. We have some submarines, we have Haida as a destroyer, and we have Sackville as a corvette, and that is it for naval ships. So both the USS North Carolina, and especially her lost sister, the USS Washington, deserve to be remembered.